I was invited here to talk about one of these voucher systems. The Swedish one was introduced in 1992, so we have 32 years of experience of having school vouchers. And I will give you a background why this was introduced and what happened, and also discussed some experiences, positive and negative, from the Swedish voucher system and its implementation. And if we start before 1992, Sweden had in the 1980s, until the 1980s, a very centralized educational system. The state, which means the Dutch national government, had overall responsibility for education, but funding, deciding curriculum, they operated all the schools. Some of them were assigned to municipalities, but they operated as a state entity, but the teachers were employed by the municipality but paid by the government. We also had a monopoly on and approval on all school books, etc., etc. So it's highly centralized. What happened, and I discussed this in my thesis, is that there were two parallel but not related demands for change. First of all, cost of education in Sweden escalated rapidly in the 1980s. If the responsibility was transferred to municipalities, that's also separated from the voucher in 1992. But if you draw take the line and trend line from 1980 to 1992, and see that if that had continued after 1992, instead of being now education is the largest proportion of municipal budgets, it would be at the same tax rate as we have today, the only. So we have and people realize, politicians realize that this is not sustainable. The second is that there were widespread discontent with this centralized system, one-size-fits-all system. So in 1992, this changed. But before 1992, there was public, highly centralized. There were private schools, about a handful of them. There were one Estonian school, one Jewish, and 3 boarding schools. There are 3 boarding schools catering mainly to people in the diplomatic corps. And there were some Swedish students, for example, in the Estonian school. They learned Estonian in order to escape the Swedish school system. That was minuscule. It's probably no more than probably maybe 1,000 or 2,000 students maximum that were outside the Swedish public school system. After 1992, there was a number of reforms. They transferred responsibility, not the curriculum, but all the operations of public schools to municipalities, which meant you also had cost control, because you have varying degrees of, since the labor market looked different in big cities and the countryside, cost of school buildings differ. You also have different demands from the voters in different municipalities. So you could adjust the cost rate to local demands and local markets. That was one part of it. And also meant that you for the first time could benchmark. So if you were in a municipality and you could see that the municipality looks about the same as yours, spend 30% less on the school facilities. Why can't we do that? Should we have larger schools, or should we have more efficiency in the system? So we had benchmarking. This is separated to the voucher system, we introduced at the same time for this other reason, that we were discontent with the one-size-fits-all public schools, which was also criticized for having decreasing educational results. The problem, when we evaluate it, is from 1992 to 1995, according to Professor Elisabeth Nihlfors in Uppsala University, there were 50 major education reforms in Sweden. They were not as substantial as the voucher reform, but they changed the organization of high schools, they changed the grading systems, they changed testing, evaluation. We also have supervisory authorities that should evaluate schools and handle applications. Lots of them also changed the education of teachers, etc., etc. The length of some high school programs, they changed the number of high school programs, they introduced specializations. So it's hard to disentangle effects from any of these because you have confounding variables. But if we try to do that anyway, we could see some things. So here's like what would happen, that municipalities decide on compensation. They could control costs. So, but you have to give, after 1998, that was a technical change, but the basics are that you should give the public schools a number of Swedish kronas per student, and you should give the same to any approved independent schools, as they're called, which are privately operated. Students have the choice between any private schools and also between public schools. Prior to that, you were automatically allocated to the public school closest to your home. You can also, because some municipalities do cooperate, for example, about 25 municipalities in the Stockholm area cooperate, so you could choose schools in other municipalities, but they have like this, like a clearing system, so they pay each other. What was already introduced that you could start independent schools, but they need government approval. You have to submit an application. You have like legal and financial obligation, but also initially, the municipalities had a veto for establishment of new schools. Because you had to show that the establishment of a new independent school was not detriment to the municipal school system, and municipalities could say no. They can't do that anymore, but that also had some impact on the establishment of these schools initially. And also, there is a standard curriculum. All the municipal schools have to follow the standard curriculum. Independent school could have some specialties. They could cater to minorities, language minorities, also some religious minorities, and they can also have some other specializations, special pedagogy, like Montessori, etc. But these are quite uncommon. They can't also these prior system of private schools did charge tuition from parents. If you are an independent school and receive a voucher, you can't charge anything extra. So it's a flat rate. It doesn't matter. Within the municipality, it's the same for everybody. So some effects. I will go into some of these in more detail, but to summarize, students in independent schools, which might be a selection, because if you choose an independent school, you have at least a small sign indicating that you are somewhat interested in your kids' education. So it might be a selection effect. But if we look at the studies, there are clear evidence that students in independent schools, even if you adjust for like measurable characteristics of students, like parents' educational background, if you're an immigrant or not, income, etc., they perform better. That's beyond dispute. Competition also, and this was one of the intentions it's also by choice, but also to improve quality and cost control. So if you look, competition causes, as is causally proven in some studies, that you have the improved educational outcomes also in schools that are the municipal schools or in the municipalities. If you increase competition, educational will increase. The effect, however, is very small, or it's small to very small. So it's positive, but small. There are also studies. I did one a couple of years ago together with 3 other researchers on violence. If you introduce competition, violence will be reduced in schools because, for obvious reasons, people don't like that. So if their kids are subject to violence from other pupils, they will choose another school. So we have a significant decrease when you introduce competition or increase competition. Violence in existing schools will go down. This is also a causal effect. However, there are lots of studies on this. McCloskey mentioned that there were mixed effects. I should say that every study with a decent method have found positive effects on education outcome, even though they are in some minuscule. However, if you look at studies on cost, segregation effects, if you discuss segregation, you should know that if everybody is allocated to the school closest to your home and you have residential segregation, you will have as much segregation in schools as you have residential. But if you disregard this factor and assume that there is no residential segregation or within a smaller district where you can't find it, there are mixed results. There are mixed results on cost. I will come to that why. There are some complaints, which some of them might be serious because they could question the legitimacy of the system, which about grade inflation, that schools are giving students higher graded than expect in comparison to the level of knowledge that they should have for a certain grade. Here, however, competition might not be the culprit, and I think that's important. It could be, but it's not necessarily so, and these studies are pointing in various directions, various method, various time periods, and also some of these methods used are, I should say, very flawed, but there are studies published on various aspects that are pointing in various directions. I made one on grade inflation and found out that it's possible that we have grade inflation on a system level, but competition could not be the causal effect because it's not connected to interactional competition. But if every school give somewhat higher grades at the same rate, you could still have it because that's very hard to control for. So, but the problem is that for the first 10 years, we had very little competition. I will show you later on how it looks today, but after 10 years, the first year is about 1% have switched to independent schools. Most of them were these formerly private, tuition charging schools that transformed or reincorporated as independent schools, and some schools that were closed down by municipalities that were taken over by the teachers, by parents, or community groups in order to provide education in an area where the municipality told, okay, this school is closing down, but we still want to have our kids here. So, but for the first 10 years, very little establishment of new schools. Most of them were also small. They had specialized curricula. They catered to small groups, so they couldn't really expand. So they were not attractive to the average students because most people, if you are not part of a language minority, you will not go to that school if there are other choices. People went to the Estonian school, but that was also an exception to the rule. We also had, and we still have, few large independent schools. And these schools are in Sweden, and I think that's one of the major problems, both with evaluating these effects, because if you look at the research on education outcomes, you can see that there are economics of scale in the school system. If you look at American research, which are the most advanced, you can see that when the efficient size of a school, which might have different units, but is about between 1,400 and 2,100 students. The average school size in Sweden is around 200. So it's hard to operate small schools for quality reasons, because it's harder to hire teachers. If you could offer a full-time position in Spanish, that's easier than you have to if you are hiring a teacher that is teaching Spanish, biology, maths, and physical education. So the pool will reduce and quality will go down. So smaller schools are harder to operate. They're also more dependent on performances both of specific teachers, specific administrators, and the results from specific students. Also, schools have fixed costs. They have administration, they have HR, they have to handle reporting, personnel affairs, procurement, facilities can't be smaller than a certain size, etc. So there are scale economies in the school system, which means that it's harder to run small schools. And some of these effects, since the independent schools now they're about the same size, but that's 30 years after reform. So if you control for school size, most of that study has found on negative effects on independent schools are gone because they are connected to school size. But these might not be independent because independent schools might have chosen to be small. So it might still be an independent school effect, which could be a size effect. So we could have expected a larger effect on educational outcome. If you look at the theoretical model going back to Milton Friedman, they are not as large as you would expect it. But I think that these factors might explain some of it. Still, you also have that 70%, regardless of the introduction of choice, especially in primary school, 70% of students go to school that's close to their home still. And there have been surveys. I took part in one in 2018 where we asked parents who have chosen a school for the kids, what was the most important factors when choosing a school? And they said like this violence issue was on top, but it was like teacher quality, number of teachers, their reputation, et cetera. But regardless what they answered in this survey, they still 70% of them chooses the school closest to home. So, and that would diminish the competitive pressure on other schools. So we have less competition than you could theoretically expect from a voucher system. The third, or the last, I should say, this is fourth here. The last explanation that I would point to is that one of the ideas behind the introduction of competition was that non-performing or badly performing schools should close down. Didn't really happen. What happened is that they lost students and continue to operate with fewer students. That's primarily public schools, but also some independent schools that fail to attract students. And I think that the explanation here is that most of the early independent schools were driven by idealists. They were driven by the idea they should provide like certain pedagogic methods, they should cater to a certain group, et cetera. They were not businessmen. They had good intentions, but they were not very good at business. And they tried to support their school even after it was economically viable. So, and also an effect that would reduce competition or reduce potential competition in the educational system. Here is a picture. This is Swedish, and from 92, 93. It's one start without. This is the red is high school students. It's high school students, and the green one is 1 to 10 students. So it's 30% of high school students and 16% of students in 1 to 10 that are in independent schools. It's still pretty low. And most of them are concentrated to the big city areas. In Stockholm, it's higher. In the Stockholm area, it's higher. Out in the countryside, there are still, Sweden had 290 municipalities. A couple of years ago, 100 of them did not have any competition at all. Now it's somewhat less than that, but I think this is still about 80 municipalities that have no competition still, 32 years after the introduction of the voucher reform. So competition, this market have not stabilized. We have still very small school. This size, especially for independent school, is increasing over time, but the average size is still fairly small by international standards. What happened after 1998, you can see it here, is here, here's 98. What happened is that we introduced for-profit corporate groups. They have an incentive to expand. If you look at the competitive effect from them, they increase competitive pressure, so you have larger effects on existing schools when they establish a new unit. And in comparative to a school that catered to what I call idealist schools, which might have the potential student body is 50 or 100. These are standardized. They are also, since they are for profit, they want to run their operations more efficiently. They have larger school units. One of them, the International English School, which teaches in English, have about 700, which is significantly higher than any other school operator in Sweden. But there are only 3 of them. And especially, they have about 70% of independent school students belong to one or go to school that belongs to one of these three corporate groups. So that is the major impact, but you still have less competition than expected. To go, what could you learn about from Sweden then? Something happened with this. I can't probably do anything about it because something screwed up here. But I could tell you, the system is quite popular. Most Swedes, regardless of, because this is to some extent a left-right issue, but regardless of your voting patterns and political belonging, most people think that choice is a good thing. If you ask the question, should it be possible to use money that could have gone to the kids' education for profits for corporations, you have a minority supporting that. But still people prefer choice. But the problem is that the system is questioned from opponents. One of them is that these effects on educational outcome is a result of that you can't really measure that, so you can't trust the figures. And it's partly true because there is a lack of external objective quality measures in the school system. We have mentioned these international tests like PISA and TIMSS and PEARLS. They cover not all students. They are not covering all the subjects. They are not adjusted to the Swedish curricula and the balance between different subjects. If you are, for example, compare Sweden with Germany, you probably have different hours allocated for math and your mother tongue, which are like intentional policy decisions, but if you study more math, you will probably be better at math. So some of them reflect policy decisions, not what the quality of the school system. And as long as we don't have that, you could question the result of education outcome. And I think that's a lesson to learn if you want to introduce a Voucher system. Ensure that you could measure value added and quality objectively outside the schools. Because if grading is done by teachers, national tests are not testing everything. And I don't think that these results, because I have a colleague, he looked into the PISA results and for math, the latest, and controlled for a number of factors because he had access to this data. He found that if you control these results, not only hold, but you have more significant results than what is usually known, because if you compare apples to apples, which you don't do, because what happened during this time also that the mix of students have changed quite a lot, and it's hard to account for. What I should say that what Sweden did, and this is hard to do policy-wise, is that I think for the first 10, 15 years, most schools that were established as independent school offered intellectual school vouchers were run or established by people without any background in operating a company. They were teachers, they were parents, people that were highly interested in education, but they probably didn't have skills in accounting, business law, or things like that, which is necessary. This was also entrenched later on, because I think it was 2006 that Sweden decided, in order to be the headmaster of a independent schools, you needed to have a headmaster education and previous experience. So you restricted outsiders to go into the system. You could hire someone, but you need to get approval, so you need to have someone from the inside in order to operate one of these schools. And I think that's put a restriction on the potential competition effects that you otherwise would have found. Another restriction that I should have mentioned previously, but it's important, is if you look, for example, you have other reforms that might have distorted effects. For example, also in I think 2008, Sweden, this is not very common in Sweden, but it's common in the United States. Sweden introduced occupational licensing for teachers, which, if you look at the literature on occupational licensing, usually means that the licensee will have better pay, but quality will go down because you limit the pool that you recruit from. This is very possible that happened, but it's not been examined in Sweden, but it's a likely effect. The other simultaneous effects from 1992, also, but to some extent from the same people advocating vouchers, also to a large extent advocated progressive education. So you will have, we only have, not only had about 50 or more major school reforms in the early 1990s, you also have a switch to more progressive in education. And I have not studied the impact of that, but it's likely that you might see effects on educational outcomes. The last point I have here that you can't really read is, which is also hard policy-wise, but I think if you want to copy the Swedish system, you should look into that, because I think that's the major problem is that a large number of schools are below minimum viable size to operate. So you must ensure in some way that schools are large enough to provide like the basic quality. It's quite impossible and to run a school with 50 students. Because even though you get a fixed amount per student as the voucher amount, but you have to spend 30–50% on the fixed costs of administration, etc. And you will have also large variance in outcomes. And even though some parents like to have small school close to their home, it's very hard to do. It's hard to say exactly here is the minimum size that you should have, but this is something that you should take into consideration if you want to copy the Swedish system. This is basically my short version of lesson. There are lots to say about this, and I could go into specifics if you want to, so I leave the last on my presentation for questions. So thank you for.
Yes, please. Gentleman there.
I have perhaps a little bit a question which is not really covered by your figures or ideas, but I've been on a seminar in Södertälje a few years ago, and I was amazed, if you're coming from this area, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, also Liechtenstein, Switzerland is speaking many languages, but then I heard by somebody of city administration in Södertälje that they have to provide service for 81 nationalities. And so I want at least ask, timidly asking, we talked about closeness to the school, about good teachers and so, and you told me that on the countryside there's less emphasis about having new schools. Could it be an issue that, well, the picture of Sweden we had, at least in the center of Europe, has changed? Huh? You had a lot of immigration and also problems, at least what I hear, what I read. Might this be an issue in creating new schools or not creating schools, for example, in the countryside, where this problem is more relevant?
To address the last question, I think it's quite natural that you don't have many schools in the countryside, because it's hard to run schools that are large enough to sustain themselves more than temporarily. If you don't have these idealists that want to put a lot of their own time and money into it, and it will maybe eventually fail anyway. So I think we could see a movement. I made a study using data from 1997 to 2013 on independent schools. I think the average size of independent school was 56. Now it's 219. So it's and what happened is this is the average. It's not median. The smallest have closed, and there were lots of experimentation in the beginning and didn't turn out well. The immigration issue is important for two reasons. Some of these schools are specialized for kids with immigrant background. And in Södertälje, for example, there are quite large language groups. They don't teach in Syriac or Arabic. Some of them, most of them don't do that. They have like the standard curriculum teaching in Swedish. But they could cater to these groups anyway. There are these types of schools. And they are not doing that bad. So it's not the problem. However, it will have impact on the school system if you are trying to educate someone who arrived when he or she is 8 or 9, have not gone to a high-quality school system before, maybe have some education, some of them have not, and don't learn language. You could don't expect the same results. So that's one part. Problem is you look at statistics. If you compare educational outcomes from 1980s, early 1990s, you have in the column of foreign background. That means something different today than it did in 1989. It might be someone who arrived in Sweden from Switzerland or Germany or Britain or Denmark, or maybe from Iran, which had decent education at least. In the early 1990s, there were quite a lot of immigrants from former Yugoslavia. Quite a lot of them had a decent educational background. They had to learn the language, but when they knew Swedish, they did pretty well. Compare that if you have that have been denied access to previous education. You will expect different outcomes. So and that's why I'm saying you should compare apples to apples. So if you only say immigrant background, you will have lower results when it comes to educational outcomes. But if you control for these factors, you might, for example, what Helle Sahlgren, he's quoted in my paper, did. He looked only to Swedish background students. And then you can see if you went to independent school controlled for family background, etc., the level of knowledge in mathematics, which was tested in PISA, this is an external test, so you can't say that this is our teachers giving too high grades for their own students. That the impact, what we call independent school effect, was about 1 year of learning at the time you took the PISA test. So that's a large effect. But this will be reduced if you only compare on a Swedish level and you have significant inflow of kids that have no or limited previous educational background.
Mm-hmm. It's so difficult to distinguish apples in themselves, right? There's many forms of apples, and that's one of the problems of econometric analysis. And I was also wondering about the point you made, or couldn't quite make, on grade inflation. Yeah. You know, one of the consequences of the system is that students feel like customers in a way, right? And I see that at my private university. I kind of think that the quality of their work is going down, but they start whining if you don't give them an A grade, and they're out of their mind if you think your work is okay, but I'm not gonna give you the best grade I can, and perhaps it's a kind of a culture change, or they think that they are just so super, and their parents keep teaching them that they are wonderful kids, and all the rest is against them. But grade inflation in a way is hard to identify or link to some causal relations in that respect. Can you perhaps give us some more ideas how this relates to the voucher system, perhaps?
This is a good question, because this is part of the dispute. Because if you're an opponent to school vouchers, you will probably point to that two things: that they are spending resources that rightfully belong to students on corporate profits. That's one of the arguments. The other is that if you have competition, schools will be incentivized, instead of giving the students the correct grade, they will say, the parents or the student will say, if you don't give me an A, I will choose another school. So we'll have a great influential incentive in the school system due to competition. That's the way to talk about it. And I think the argument theoretically makes sense. If you look at the results, however, it's not very clear. if I did the study I did, because as you said, this is hard to identify causally, because if everybody's doing it this hard, I can't isolate that every school in Sweden, public or private, without or with competition, are increasing the grades artificially, with like 2 percentage points a year. I can't control for that. That's beyond my ability. But what I could do is to see what are the differences and changes when you introduce competition, and also what we did, if you have a school that's saying, in order to attract students or not leave students, we should give students that ask for higher grades, we should give them the grade they ask for. This shouldn't be different between boys and girls. So what we did is to use the difference between boys and girls to control for that, and then we could see if there was a causal effect between grade inflation and competition, and found that even if there is grade inflation on a national level, it's not driven by competition. So there is a method to do that, so you could isolate, and it's
smart.
So, and the other studies that have looked into grade inflation, they have used different tests, but there you could see that these results could be disputed because there are a number of factors. But it's you could probably agree that you shouldn't say, let's only give the girls a high grade, not the boys. So I think that that's a good method, and I think that the method is not driven by competition. I think the mechanism behind it is harder to see. I think there is that most teachers don't want to do that. I could give my students a higher grade because it doesn't cost me anything, but I would still not give every student an A because they don't deserve it. This is like a professional ethics in the system. I think most teachers are part of this professional teacher ethics, and we should put a lid on the amount of grade inflation you could have. But it's still, you will have it, because if you have a test and I go to you as a teacher and say, could you please have a second look at my test results? I will only do that if I'm disappointed with the result. If I know that I got a higher score than I expected, so you will have, this scale will be truncated from the bottom. So you will have some grade inflation, like by design, but it could explain that you have it, but this is not connected to competition or vouchers in a way.
I see. Okay, thanks.
My children have studied in the US, and they were very disappointed when the grades for the whole class were curved. You talk about inflation, but that's even worse, because everybody's grade gets sort of, you know what the curving means in terms of grading, right? That they take all the numbers together, they divide it evenly between the students, so that the best gets a lower grade and the worst gets a higher grade.
Yeah, that's also what Claudia was mentioning in her talk about even things as they go on in Switzerland, right? That we would like to, don't want to have great differentiation, right? Differentiation and inflation are two different kinds of things.
Yeah.
All right. We still would have some time for discussion, but in the program it also says general discussion, so it doesn't have to be exactly on Erik's paper. And since we still have all of the speakers here, perhaps you have a question you just missed to ask before lunch, or on Argentina, some urgent question, or something on Immanuel Kant and the role of the state in coercion and education, or anything else that on the broad topic itself. This is the opportunity for some educated debate on this topic, if you like. We still have time, but I know you might as well like to ask a question, Herr van Wachter.
I have to get an encouraging remark on Neil McCluskey was Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
About the good news from Arizona and 10 states. Can you tell us how did these states get to that not ideal situation, but very good situation? And can you derive some advice for our countries from your experience there or observations there?
All right. Just wait for the microphone so we can get translation if we...
So the good news is we have 50 states, so we have a lot of really bad ones. Arizona is, you can say, generally speaking, until you get to California, the further west you go, the more freedom-loving the states are. That's not entirely accurate, but then you hit California and everything falls apart. And Arizona has a lot of new development, a lot of new people. It's very low regulation. So it already had a sort of an ethos and a culture that was probably more inclined to freedom and education than other states. But it took about 15 years of their implementing smaller programs that progressively got bigger. And then finally, COVID-19, this is a major impact, I think, on all of school choice. A lot of people who had liked their public school, they were no longer able to access that in the way they wanted. They couldn't physically send their children to education. And so a lot of people who were probably on the margins of school choice but disliked it, fell on that side, changed their minds. And so Arizona was the first place you'd expect to see a big change, and that's where it happened. The state of Florida is very similar. They had a lot of school choice before COVID-19. They are now universal. And we saw a lot of governors, so people who, the executive of the state, have started to say if there are legislators from their party who won't vote for school choice, they will campaign against them. So in the state of Iowa, that's what the governor did. The governor lost 1 year on school choice and said, I'm going to campaign against people in my own party in the primary so that those people lose, and they lost. So there are politicians who are prepared, after COVID-19 in particular, to put things on the line politically. We'll see how it works out. If we get a lot of bad outcomes or people are very unhappy, we may not see universality last, but COVID-19 was the real driver. Some states were moving to school choice for a long time, Arizona first among them, but COVID-19 put a lot of them over the edge toward full school choice. I don't know how much of that is applicable to different countries. I would imagine there's some European countries that are more inclined to choice. I would think Sweden is one of the closer ones. I would guess the Netherlands, but I don't know enough about the politics in any country to say who may make it.
Yes, please. Gentleman here.
Thank you very much. When I go home, I come with a mixed feeling of today's learning. One is that ideologically, school choice is very good. But second, that the hard data does not support it because it's weak. Correlations are weak, and sometimes even in the opposite direction. So what shall I refine my understanding of today's time spent here? Maybe the indoctrination risk is much more important than any number, or maybe the tests of correlation tests are not significant. What can I upgrade what I bring home in a too simplistic way, maybe?
I think I could add something to that, because my intention was not to say you should be very pessimistic of the outcomes of school vouchers, because I think since there are some of these effects that we can see, they're still positive, but you have other changes at the same time. We discussed like the change of the mix of students, which means that you should have expected, if you introduce a large number of pupils that don't know Swedish, you will have worse outcomes by default. But we didn't have that. If you look, they are increasing, but probably not as much as expected. We also had, I mentioned, Sweden introduced occupational licensing for teachers. Probably have, if you look at it, there is a study from Kleiner and someone else, 2023, like looking at the welfare effects in the educational system in the United States, 18%. So if you have a number of things that are expected to lead to lower results and you don't get lower results, but you get like a small positive, you could still that vouchers might, even though you could say this is not causal relation because the causal relation has not been econometrically proven. But if you look at it, there are factors that are likely that Sweden would have looked much worse without the school voucher system and without school choice. The question I've studied some specific parts of it. I looked into grading, what happened in the mechanism behind it, why are these, because I also found that these corporate groups were, if you compare the grades, the relation to test scores within these groups and without that, this could be like a large school effect. So larger schools are doing better because they have like internal quality controls, but they could lose, since they are for profit, if they are cheating, they could lose their licenses. So they are much more reluctant to cheat than someone else because there's more on stake. So there is one such factor. The last factor I would point to here is that there are some things that have happened generally, which most people would say they are good. You have this general decline in violence in school that's significant. We have, for example, when I went to the Swedish school system in the 1980s, every school had, if you look at cost, for example, I discussed that costs are significantly, the trend line was like this until 1992, and it became like this. So it's a kink, you can see it in my thesis. There's a significant kink on the cost of it. It didn't stop increasing, but the rate of increase was much lower. You had a benchmark between different students. You had learning, you adopted practices that might not affect educational outcome that much, but they might affect cost. One example which I was referring to when I was going back to my own education in the Swedish 80s, that every junior high school or upper secondary school had one room for physics, one for biology, and one for chemistry. If the school was not large, these rooms were idle for 25–30% of the week. So today, no Swedish schools, private or public, have separate rooms or classrooms for biology and chemistry. That doesn't mean that you have the taxidermy animal standing next to the Bunsen burner, but they are in the same room, so you will save 20–30% without any impact on education, but you save on cost. So these factors might explain that the Swedish, because the Swedish education system is not that expensive. It could have been. If we have followed a trend from before 1992, it would probably be extremely expensive. And the other factor, I have not mentioned all the counter factors. There have been calls for limiting class sizes, etc., etc. Teacher pay have went up significantly, not only due to, because that's a separate effect due to occupational licensing, but if you only have one potential employer, they could put a pressure on teacher wages.
All right.
So these are factors. I don't think you should be that pessimistic.
And perhaps if I might add, there are factors in the value of liberty that you cannot show econometrically, right? This is a point that Hayek made so many times, that the value of freedom does not depend in its empirical, obvious results that we can see. So things like Pauline, when she was talking about dignity, right, or freedom to choose as a value in itself, all these things your belief in these values should not be shattered by some mixed results in terms of one specific policy instrument that does not even include the privatization, the full privatization of education. And Herr Ronheimer might say something similar.
Do you have any data about success of people having visited the independent schools in later university studies, dropout rates, and are there differences or are there data about how they perform after they have left their schools and entering higher education?
There are studies concerning this. One is references in the paper Böllmark and Lindahl 2015. You have a higher rate of students from independent school continue at university. But it could be selection effects. It's hard to control. But there are these. But I agree with you. I think that the reason for the majority of Swedish families and Swedish voters are in support of school choice is for the reason that the value choice in itself, not for that they have like these econometric studies showed that cost went down or up or something like that. I think that that's a choice in itself. But I think if you want to convince people, you have to say, yeah, choice is one thing, people like that. But if you have, and that could cater to people that have children of their own that might go to school, or they have like the intrinsic value of choice themselves. But you say, if it is costly and lead to negative externalities for other people, I might be against it. So it's important to say that these external effects don't exist or are very small.
All right. Yeah. Martin, no?
You just said it.
Yeah.
I just said it. I'm glad that you could have done as well. But I think this is a good opportunity to say thank you very much, Erik and Paulina, once again.